Hey LFC, welcome to week 2 of our life group study through the book of Amos, and we're just going to jump right in. And so we see Amos coming from the south, going to the north. He's a prophet to the northern nation of Israel, these 10 tribes that have split from the southern 2. But what's interesting and unique about the prophet Amos is that when he gets to Israel, he doesn't just immediately start jumping on the sins of Israel. What we read through the first chapter and the first half of chapter 2 is that Amos starts by proclaiming the sins against the surrounding nations. He starts with Damascus, who has struggled with being an oppressive and an abusive nation. Then he gets into the sins of Gaza, who is involved with human trafficking. Then he comes and he talks about the sins of Tyre, who also is involved with human trafficking and expressing covenant unfaithfulness. At one point, Tyre had a relationship with Israel and Judah, and they broke it. Then he gets into the sins of Edom. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. So out of every other nation, they should have had a respect and a sense of courtesy towards Israel and Judah, or to anybody. But they had this burning anger that they expressed on a continual basis. And God calls them out on it. And then he gets into the Amorites, who they've tried to express and control the population by killing innocent children. Then he gets into the sins of Moab, who have desecrated the remains of a king from another nation. This is something that God takes very serious, as even though that king may not have been a believer, he was an image bearer. And for them to desecrate a human body is sin. And that was just a sin on top of many other sins. Then he gets into the southern nation of Judah. And Amos talks about how even Judah, they've failed to live up to the covenant that they made with God at Mount Sinai. And he goes through all of these nations. They have these great sins, and it's for the purpose of showing that God, even though he may not have a covenant relationship with all the surrounding nations, he still has a right to judge them. That he is their creator, that he is their judge, and that he has a right to point out their sins. And you'll notice too that each time that Amos addresses a nation, you'll see this phrase, for 3 transgressions and for 4. What he's saying there is God has overlooked the first and second, and now he's overlooked the 3rd transgression, but he's not going to overlook it anymore. And it's important for the world to realize, yes, God is patient. He is gracious. We see in 2 Peter that God is not slow, but he's patient, and he desires that no one would die unsaved, that he wants all to come to the knowledge of the kingdom. But one day his patience will be no more. One day judgment will come, and he has a right to judge every nation and every person. It's also interesting here that if you were to have the northern nation of Israel, a picture of it, and have them at the center of the picture, Amos starts off looking at Damascus, and then Gaza, and then Tyre, and then the Edomites, and then the Amorites, and then Moab, and then Judah, who's right next to Israel. It's really as if Amos has put Israel in the center of a bullseye. Like they're the target. And Amos, who's this shepherd, just really courageous outdoorsman, he's got some bows and arrows. He's got a bow and arrows. And he's just firing away at this target. And he hits Damascus and then Gaza. And he goes all to the surrounding nations. And then he hits Judah. And he's got one arrow left. And Israel is at the center of the target. And this next shot, Amos isn't going to miss. For the rest of the book, after he talks about the sins of the surrounding nations and the sins of Judah, Amos is going to talk about the sins of Israel. Amos knows that because he is a shepherd from the south going to the north, he needs to show the northern nation of Israel that he's playing fair. He's not going to them with any kind of prejudice. He's being honest. Just as he sees the sins of the other nations, he sees the sins of the nation of Israel. And we're going to look at it tonight, but Jesus has a message for us as believers. That if we're going to point out the sins of others, we have to be faithful in pointing out the sins in ourselves. And so tonight, we're going to take some time on what it looks like to be a good messenger for Christ. How can we be faithful to point out the sins of others? Something that needs to be done. Sin needs to be dealt with. How can we do that faithfully in a way that Jesus commanded us? Hope you enjoyed tonight's lesson, and we'll see you next week.